Thank you, Massimo, and thank you, Indrek, for the invitation. The invitation was something that I leaped at because of what I knew and what I didn't know about Tallinn and the Hansa state in general. And the theme, one of the themes of what I want to talk about briefly today actually came to me in another Hansa city, Greifswald, in the former Eastern Germany. I was invited to give a talk there, I think it was in 1991, so shortly after the wall had come down. And I was asked to talk about a book that I just published on the American Revolution and the origins of American political thought. And I was giving the talk more or less improvised and in German. And at several points, I thought that I was coming to a very nice conclusion when I was talking about the way the Americans created eine demokratische Republik. And the public didn't react at all. They didn't seem to want to have anything to do with a model of a democratic republic because, of course, they had just gotten out of the Deutsche Demokratische Republik. And that led me to think about the difference between a republican democracy and a democratic republic. And I think perhaps that we'll see in the course of what I'm going to say, which is going to be both philosophical and historical, I think we'll be able to see that perhaps the cold monster may paradoxically be the one that comes from the Demokratische Republik, from the Democratic Republic, whereas the less monstrous form of the state would be, so I would at least suggest, a republican democracy. In other words, in the one case, to put it simply, and we'll come back to this, to put it simply, in the one case, there's an attempt that's made to suggest that the democracy, the people, and the state are one, are united, whereas in the Republican democracy, you have the constitutional framework, which does the work that Thomas Hobbes suggests that a Leviathan state would do, protecting property and so on. That Republican state is there, but it also, if it's properly organized, can, in effect, create the conditions in which popular democracy takes place and historical development can also take place. But let me, without further, without giving my speech before I actually come to the material of the speech, let me try to stick, at least an outline, to some more fairly detailed notes that I've taken here. So if we talk about the legitimacy of the state, the modern state, and by the way, there would be a distinction, I think, between the Hobbesian state and a modern state, because the Hobbesian state has no place for those typical things of modernity, like democracy, like a place of subjective, personal desire, and so on. But in the modern state, in the United States and in France, there's a seemingly paradoxical form of legitimation because they're legitimated, both of them, by the fruits of, or the principles of, their revolutions. And revolution being, of course, a radical break with the past, based upon, again, specific principles. And in both cases, France and the United States, the revolutionary foundations made solidification of Republican institutions problematic. Normal discontents, conflicts of interest, and ideological differences left to fester did not dissipate, or do not dissipate, over time. Rather, the universalist principles that founded the Republican state could at times transform those particular festering discontents, disagreements, and so on, could transform those particular griefs into universal wrongs, whose eradication seemed to demand the refoundation of the Republic. Hence, both in America and in France, you've had revolutions against the existing order based on the principles of the first revolution, as we will see. In other words, there takes place what a philosopher might call a dialectic between the universal principle and its particular realization. And this was illustrated for the first time and most clearly, I think, with regard to the modern state, in Hegel's analysis of the French Revolution, in his phenomenology of spirit, which dates from, as you know, 1806. And while the philosopher, the German philosopher, had little to say about its American cousin, it seems to me this conflict of universal principle and particular realization was resolved principally by, and politically by, the emergence of democracy. In the French case, the political revolution sought to create what I will call a democratic republic from the bottom up. Whereas the 3 decades following the American War of Independence from the British monarchy, gradually, these 3 decades, gradually saw the institution of what I will call a republican democracy. And I'll explain and illustrate these in the following. The dialectic diagnosed by Hegel was present almost from the outset of the French Revolution, namely the conflict between the universality of the revolutionary triad of liberté, égalité, fraternité, formed a sort of a stellar constellation whose realization, whose instances could not be found in the terrestrial sphere, terrestrial institutions. The principle of liberté, for example, seems to have been localized first in the political sphere on the night of the 4th of August when the aristocracy was abolished, but social privilege returned very quickly, as you know from the history of the French Revolution. Social privilege returned quickly in the form of a commercial, then later an industrial, and more recently even an intellectual aristocracy, such that political liberté shaded into the quest for social égalité. So the universal keeps sliding over. It's now looking for social égalité. And it seems from the standpoint of social égalité, we're now in sort of socialist territory, it seems as if, in effect, liberté, political liberté was simply illusory, was simply a will of a wisp, was perhaps an ideology of, as some might say. And that the need was to create some sort of material equality, whereby material equality, we mean both an equal status for all persons, and I deliberately say all persons, although it, of course, takes a while for all persons to be recognized as persons, equal status for all persons in the eyes of all. So there's a dual, again, the dialectic comes in here. There's a duality. There's got to be this two sides of the status. The problem with this is, of course, as soon as we universalize that social equality, what do we end up with? And we say that each one must be recognized as an equal person. This can very quickly shade over, as we see in contemporary Western societies, into something like an identity politics. In other words, what was aiming at a broader basis weakens. And that leads to the transformation of the quest for égalité to the quest for fraternité. And fraternité, fraternity, seemed for a moment to have been realized on the 14th of July, 1790, on the Champ de Mars, when the Fête de la Fédération brought together the masses of people. The Marseillais came up singing from the south and so on, and everything seemed wonderful. But of course, our German Virgil, who's guiding us through this mass of historical events, chronicles the French Revolution a little bit further. It doesn't end, Hegel's presentation and the revolution itself, of course, doesn't end with the Fête de la Fédération on July 14th, 1790. Hegel goes on and particularly vividly paints what can be called the period of the fraternité terreur. In other words, how can you get that universal which keeps slipping away? It went from liberty to equality, now it goes from equality to fraternity, and finally, the only way you can seemingly get to real fraternité, realize the revolution, is through the terror, imposing a universal brotherhood from above with the help of that humanitarian invention, which also dates from 1790, that invention by a certain Dr. Guillotin, which in effect leveled people literally with his sharp blade. The century of French history that was inaugurated by the revolution was eventful, and its broad outlines illustrates the dialectical dilemmas that were condensed in the first short years. If we're now talking about a span of from Waterloo, I suppose, or from the defeat of the 100 Years until the contemporary French situation. It seems to me that this dialectic keeps on recurring. The years of conquest at the outset, after 1789, were, of course, the years in which Bonaparte was transformed into Napoleon, in which the Republic was seeking to impose its principles throughout Europe and to become, in effect, an empire, ultimately an empire which would have to be universal, which is, of course, why Napoleon finds himself overstretched both across the seas in Haiti and in Russia. We can skip but mention the so-called 100 Days, when Napoleon, after having been defeated, comes back, storms up from the south. He's not General de Gaulle in Bayeux. He's recognized, he's followed, and you get another mass army, which is finally defeated by the so-called the Allies. And in effect, a restoration is set to take place. But of course, we know that the restoration didn't work too well. There's a wonderful film that's just come out in France based on on Balzac's Illusion perdue, Lost Illusions, which traces the emergence, I mean, a remarkable film that, and Balzac already traces the emergence of what we recognize as modern society. It's the story of a young man coming from the provinces who has literary ambitions. He wants to be a poet. But very quickly he finds in order to be a success in this new society, you have to become not simply a journalist, but you have to become a journalist for sale. And we get the development of modern advertising. You have a wonderful scene where you have the invention of what we know today in the theater as a claque, where an author would arrange for a separate group of people spread around the audience to applaud on schedule. When I was watching this film and saw this invention of the claque, it made me think of the Trotskyist political tactics of my youth, when Trotskyists would spread out among the audience and at a given signal would applaud or would intervene or would boo or whatever the case may be. Anyway, the restoration didn't work well, and as we know, the attempt by the monarchy to put down liberal opinion, these journalists, the attempt led to censorship. The censorship led to opposition, and in 1830 there took place another revolution, the so-called Trois Glorieuses, the 3 wonderful days of revolt, in which the Bourbon Restoration was forced to abdicate. A new liberal Orleanist monarchy came into being. And of course, the French, with their dialectical sense, once again, the new monarch, Louis Philippe, was no longer the king of the French. He was now considered the king of France. A difference, again, in the idea of the dates. And the flag of France changed. The old white Bourbon flag with the fleur-de-lis was replaced by a return of the tricolore, the three-colored bleu, blanc, rouge of the French revolutionary principle. The liberal monarchy, of course, Louis Philippe, 1830, 1848, may have given political freedoms. It brought a certain amount of renewed equality insofar as it did away with the restored aristocratic principles, but there was still a problem of fraternité. And in effect, in 1848, a renewed revolution comes into being. And I don't want to talk too much about French Revolution, so I'm going to skip some things, except to note, if I can find it, that that the 1848 revolution in February is clearly a revolution which is aiming at fraternité, built on social equality, but in effect, it doesn't go far enough. It creates the right to work, it creates the so-called workshops, but it doesn't create the work, and it doesn't put up the money. And so the February Revolution of 1848 is followed in June by another rising, which is put down in bloodshed, and as a result of which the constitutional setup that the Second Republic had created is found to be weak in one particular thing, and this is related to another aspect of our theme. In effect, the constitutional setup was set up in such a way to be as democratic as possible, which meant in that time to be non-monarchical, which entailed the idea that the president, although elected universally, would not be re-eligible. And that, of course, set up the situation in which the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, who had been elected popularly after 1848 June, saw that the only way in which he could retain power was through a coup d'etat. And so we find France moving from its second republic to another Napoleon. But this Napoleon, instead of conquering the world politically, this Napoleon wants to conquer the world economically, and this is the period of the blooming of industrial France. This is the period of the railroads. This is the period of the development of French industrial the beginnings of the development of French industrial life. But of course, one more revolution, and we're done with France for the time being. Of course, those conditions also create the possibility for, not even the possibility, seemingly the need for some reaction. And when Napoleon, the emperor, decides that he's going to need more, he doesn't use the term, but no more Lebensraum, we might say. He gets himself sucked into a war with a newly united German state. A battle takes place at Sedan, and the French are terribly defeated. But the French revolutionary élan reasserts itself immediately, because when the Germans demand the surrender of Paris, the French Commune, the Paris Commune, forms to create its own new republic. It calls this republic, interestingly, it calls this new political form a commune, suggesting perhaps another way of getting around the dilemmas of that dialectic that Hegel had formulated back at the time of the first French Revolution. And we know that the sacred script to describe the Paris Commune, which lasted for all of 72 days and was drenched in blood. The sacred text commemorating it is Karl Marx's pamphlet, The Civil War in France, which claimed that the Commune was, quote, the form at last discovered, in which the proletariat could liberate itself and govern itself. That form of equality which recognized each as a person, and in which every person recognized the other person as a person. That text, however, written by Marx in this in haste, in a defense, written while the Commune was still taking place, that text, of course, like all supposedly sacred texts, was subject to interpretation, and often subject to the most militant, one-sided, perhaps, interpretation. And in effect, it became the basis of, in particular, Lenin's famous pamphlet written just before the actual seizure of power in 1917. Lenin's text, State and Revolution, has a concluding chapter dealing with the Commune of Paris and comparing the Commune to the so-called Soviets that he was going to establish. Let me come quickly from France backwards across the the ocean to the American case. I have some notes here about how that revolutionary dialectic goes on in France, how people try to see in things like the Gilets jaunes recently, the yellow vest movements. Well, one is constantly looking for revolutionary signs. French politics in general is on the left as well as on the right, it seems to me, is better described not by Marx or Marxists, but perhaps better described in its present circumstances by Pirandello, except that there are perhaps more than 6 characters in search of an author, in search of a unity. Coming to the American Revolution and looking at the clock, the difference between the two was seen, the American and the French, was seen at the very outset by Burke, for example, and in particular, and perhaps more importantly than Burke in some ways, was seen by a German diplomat, politician, somewhat reactionary, named Friedrich Gentz, G-E-N-T-Z. And Friedrich Gentz wrote a pamphlet called The Origins and Principles of the American Revolution, compared with the origin and principles of the French Revolution. He published this in 1800. And this was a rather interesting date, as we'll see in a moment. But it was seen as by contemporaries as an important date because, or as witnessed by, the fact that Gentz's little booklet, was immediately translated by an American diplomat in Berlin at the time, named John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams, of course, was the son of John Adams, who was running for a second term in office in America against Thomas Jefferson, who was seen, whom the reader of the pamphlet by Gentz would have known stood for the French side, whereas John Adams stood for the, how should one say, for the, for the good side, let's just put it that way, simply. So the difference between the two revolutions is seen from the outset and has been portrayed in many ways. On the other hand, interestingly, during the Cold War period, so our recent past, I suppose, during the Cold War period, the classic comparison of the two revolutions, as far as I know at least, was a 2-volume book by R.R. Palmer, called The Age of Democratic Revolution. So again, a Cold War title almost, The Age of Democratic Revolution. And Palmer talks about these as the Atlantic revolutions. So far as I remember, he doesn't talk about the Caribbean as somehow part of this age of Atlantic revolutions. And he insists, and this is the important point, he insists that these revolutions were defensive revolutions. Presumably what he means is that they were defensive of, I suppose, a way of life, of a democracy, of a social democracy, simply, or an unthought about, a democratic mode of being, not quite sure what to call it. Let's just call it, as the people of the time did, the democracy, which was being threatened by this cold monster, I suppose we would say. So it was a defensive revolution. But things were changing rapidly in the 13 colonies at the time. They were 13 colonies. They were more or less independent from each other. They, however, felt threatened by Great Britain, even though a decade earlier, during the so-called 7 Years' War, the 7 Years' War in Europe, what the Americans called the French and Indian Wars, same period. And during that time, the Americans, the American colonies, insisted that they were the true Englishmen. And they insisted on their Englishness, and in their revolutionary tracts between 1763 and the Declaration of Independence in 1776, their revolutionary tracts insisted on their rights being invaded by the British, the rights of an Englishman against the corruption of their colonial masters. So the British had gotten self-contented, gotten fat, had gotten greedy. And you can see this, for example, in the person of the general who would become the first American president, George Washington. George Washington had been a general in the British, fighting with the British forces against the French during the 7 Years' War, during the French and Indian War. Indeed, he had been the leader of the British troops in the battle in 1758 called the Battle of Fort Necessity. I'm not sure why they called it Fort Necessity, but he was the defeated general at Fort Necessity in 1758, and yet in 1775, so not much later, it was to him, actually, excuse me, 1781, it was to him that the British surrendered in the Battle of Yorktown, which put an end to the American War of Independence. Now, the independent America took the political form of a confederation. And the Constitution, so-called, was the Articles of the Confederation. Yet the 13 colonies were quite different amongst themselves. They had all sorts of quarrels, all sorts of difficulty in coming to agreements. You had artisan agricultural states, you had slave plantation states, you had commercial states, you had one state, or one colony, I still might call it, the smallest, was the one that gave them the most problems and was the last one to join the later new union, the colony of Rhode Island. Tiny little Rhode Island was a commercial hotspot because the authorities decided that the best way to encourage prosperity was to look the other way while smuggling was taking place. Boston was also a center of smuggling and so on. So a group of leaders among the colonies, recognizing this anarchic situation, and recognizing, moreover, that their state, such as it was ripe for conquest. Don't forget that on the North American continent at the time, you had a Spanish colony down in Florida, you had the French down in Louisiana, you had the Mexican more or less autonomous state. You had lots of temptations for colonial reconquest of a weak United States. And so these leaders, both for economic and for political reasons, recognized the need to come together. And a group of them self-selected, self-selected, and then through certain manipulations that are too complicated to go through, managed to get themselves named as delegates to a convention to reform the Articles of Confederation. And they, in order to do this, they say, well, we must meet secretly. In other words, not non-publicly. Everybody knew they were meeting in Philadelphia, but the meetings were closed. The leaders of the city of Philadelphia agreed to let them to make things as easy as possible for them. They scattered sawdust around the meeting place so that the clop, clop, clop of horses' feet wouldn't disturb the deliberations. And they met together through the hot months of July and August in Philadelphia. And instead of reforming the Articles of Confederation, they proposed a new constitution. So it was, in effect, a constitutional coup d'etat, if you will, except that they recognized that there's a problem of legitimacy. And they argued that their new constitution would have to be ratified by popular vote in all, by all and in all of the other colonies. So in that sense, they're creating a republic and building for it a democratic basis. And in effect, the Constitution that they proposed was, again, built on all of the inherent contradictions of political thinking at the time. Some of the founding fathers described their institutions as, quote, a machine that would go on forever. So you have that mechanical image, and they set it up in terms of a system of checks and balances so that, in effect, this machine would constantly be correcting itself. There would be dare I say, a dialectic between the powers that constituted the powers that were the institutions of the country. It was to be, quote, a government of law and not of men. But at the same time, it had to have this democratic foundation. One thing that they added in the last article of the Constitution that, again, suggests at least a recognition of the need to recognize the role of the people, the role of democratic choice. The Constitution has a procedure for amendment. For example, if we go back for a second to the French Second Republic, when Louis Napoleon is elected popularly president, and he sees that he's not eligible for a second term, it's clear that it was clear to people for months before that something bad was going to happen because he wasn't going to give up power so easily. In all events, so there's a procedure for amendment, and finally, the final element that made the institutions work was that they knew that the pretty much undefined function of the presidency would not be a threat because it was assumed by everyone, and came to be the case, that General Washington would become the president, because Washington, you may remember this history, you may not, Washington, after the independence had been won, Washington refused offers to become the new monarch, the new king of America. He insisted no, he would return to his farm. And of course, all Americans in those days, not like Americans today, all Americans in those days knew their Roman history, and they knew the story of Cincinnatus, the Roman named dictator to fight off the enemy, who immediately then returned to his farm once again. which is why you have a number of cities in the United States called Cincinnati. Anyway, the one problem in there were lots of problems. The debates in the ratifying conventions, in effect, took place between the so-called Federalist faction, Constitutionalist faction, supporting the new institutions, and those who criticized those new institutions for being non-democratic. So you had Federalists and Anti-Federalists competing. And one of the bones of contention, and the one that I'll point to because we're getting on in time, one of the bones of contention was, what is the Senate doing here? Why do we have a Senate? If we have a democracy, isn't it the case that senates are set up for the aristocratic? Senates are there to balance. Senates are there. The image that they like to use was that the Senate was like the cup in which you poured your coffee when it was too hot and let it cool off. So they were anti-democratic. And here, the Americans make a fundamental assertion. It comes in the so-called Federalist Papers, which were the defense of the Constitution, written under the pseudonym of Publius, again the Roman stuff, written under the name of Publius, and it was actually authored by, for the most part, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. And the writing of those Federalist Papers, as far as I remember, doesn't appear in that now best-selling play called Hamilton, but that's an aside. The defense that Federalist 63 offers is to very clearly distinguish between a classical Senate and classical political institutions in general, which were meant to incarnate the principles of the class or classes that were represented by them. Whereas the Americans say, no, we want those institutions as representatives. We insist that the people, the democracy, is present not in one or another institution, but it's present in all of the American institutions. It's present in the House of Representatives. It's present in the presidency, who is, after all, popularly elected. It's present in the judiciary, which judges, the constitutional judiciary, judges in terms of the Constitution, which was ratified by the unanimous people, and which has provisions for amendments so that you can't say that the Constitution is this old document that represents the way people thought in 1787. It's able to be updated. Now, one last step in the illustration. I said that one of the keys to the acceptance of the Constitution was that they were sure that the presidency would go to Washington. But of course, Washington, after his second mandate, after his second term, went home to his slaves. But that's another story. Went home, and he was succeeded. The elections took place, and the contest was between Thomas Jefferson, who by that time had come to, in effect, be more favorable to the principles of the French Revolution and to be more, to stand for those universal principles that were in his version of the Declaration of Independence, which begins, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with a certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the Jefferson that's considered to be the Democrat. And the other thing that Jefferson was known for and that was fundamental to the Jeffersonian principles. Jefferson, as a state legislator, had introduced and defended the principle of, what do you call it? The principle that the separation of church and state, the separation of church and state, the what we would call the secular, that the American government was a secular government. So you have a contest between the successor of Washington, who's John Adams, as I said, the father then of John Quincy. Adams is elected in 1796, and he's up for re-election in 1800. And once again, Jefferson is opposing him. The election was extraordinarily heated, and the rhetoric flew in all directions. It was rhetoric directed, as General de Gaulle would say, tous azimuts, in all directions. Curiously, Jefferson won the election. When I hesitated there, I'm trying to figure out how time is flying, and it's flying, so I'll come to a quick end. Jefferson is elected, and he takes office on March 13th, I believe, of 1801. The night before Adams leaves office, before he loses all his power, he appoints a number of his friends, Federalists, to judgeships, to official positions. I mean, good politician, you prepare the next step, in effect, for your return. And Jefferson came to power, and he told his Secretary of State, don't give them the documents saying that they have this office, because this is, as we New Yorkers would say, this appointment was not kosher. It was not done the way it should have been done. And the case of one of these appointees, a man named Marbury, finally comes before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1803. And this is the foundation of Constitution of this is the case that affirms, in my eyes at least, the democratic foundation of the American Republic. The judge in the case is John Marshall, who was the decisive judge on the Supreme Court for nearly 30 years. Interestingly, he had been appointed by Adams only a month earlier, Adams thinking that he had an ally here. But Marbury knew, as hopefully the judges on the Supreme Court in the United States will know in the next couple of months when they have to when they face the possibility of overturning several liberal rulings, whether it's abortion, whether it's voting district adjustments, and so on. He knew that Marshall knew that he had to protect the legitimacy of the court. That if it was seen as a political court, it would lose its legitimacy, and so he came up with a contorted argument, which I have written down here, but I will not bother you with because it really is has all the virtues. It has all the virtues of jurisprudential reasoning. Comes up with an argument that basically is similar to the argument that I mentioned from Federalist 63, that is to say, for the Senate, that is to say that in the United States, because it's a democracy, because the Constitution represents the will of the people is therefore present in all of the institutions established by the Constitution. That is to say, not only in the Senate, not only in the House, but also in the federal states, in the localities, etc. So that you have this mixing together in a way that gives you, and this is my last sentence, it gives you a republican form of government, a government of laws, not of men, a republican government whose basis is this structure, this interweaving of democratic institutions. And final anecdote, on the day that the Constitutional Convention closed its deliberations and began signing off on the document, the founding fathers came out of their meeting room. People of Philadelphia were waiting around, and an older woman supposedly turned to the sage of the American intelligentsia, who was Benjamin Franklin, and asks him, "Dr. Franklin, what have you created?" And Franklin is said to have replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." And that's where we still find ourselves, unfortunately or fortunately, still today. Thank you.